Okay, welcome back, everyone. Press Corda here, and we are now going to move on to our third and final area for CIS 102. We're going to talk about verbal communication. Now, what we're not going to do is give presentations. We'll let speech classes take care of that, but I think it's still important to have an understanding of the foundations of what we mean by verbal communication. So I'm going to go ahead and let's start by taking a look at this week's activities. So again, part five of the written professional letters part of the written communication is due. If you didn't get it in, please get it in so we can get some points in for you. You are now watching, obviously, the video in number two. This give you again a good heads up of what's going on. Now, with verbal communication, we started the third book, verbal communication. So we are moving into that. Now, are we going to cover all of verbal communication? Well, that depends. It all depends upon how much time we have left, which I think we only have about 4 weeks, maybe. I'm not clear on that, but it's the end's coming up pretty quick. Do we have a final exam? No, we don't, but there will be a final assignment that you will complete. But we'll talk more about that when we get closer to it. So again, part one of verbal communication is basically understanding the basics of what we call verbal communication. And I see here I did not spell verbal right, it's herbal, but no, we're talking about verbal communication here. So it's pretty much the same setup. There are 7, 8 sections. There are the sheets that you will have to complete and upload those as you always have. And there are videos associated. So I'm going to go ahead and stop this share. Let's go to a different one. Let's take a look at the fact sheet and I'll give you a few pointers of what we're talking about this week. So here we go. Verbal communication, part one, understanding the basics. And again, all these videos are in the YouTube channel and they should be posted in the order that you will see them. First thing we'll talk about is organizing your message. Well, there is a process to communication, which is kind of like the process of writing. You really need to figure out what you're going to say, how you're going to open it up, what you're going to talk about detail wise, and then, frankly, how you're going to end this up. And it's if you've had a speech course, this is really nothing new, but it still is important to have in your mind, especially if you're going to have a meeting, a verbal meeting, or an actual formal presentation, what you're going to say instead of doing it off the cuff. It doesn't work out very well that way. So at least have some notes of how you want to formulate that. Now, this first video communication process will tell you, well, how is this process? What is this thing called communication? Well, communication, you need to have two or more people. You need to have a sender and a receiver. Now, there are specifics that the sender does, and there are specifics that the receiver has to do. The video will take this into great detail. It will tell you that the sender needs to think about the message, needs to organize the message, but it needs to actually kind of think through what the message will contain. The sender will then identify what the medium is, for lack of a better term. How are we going to send this? Is this going to be a verbal conversation? Or will this be another form of conversation? Now, in our case, we're talking verbal. So that's how we do it. Next, you will then encode the message, meaning put the message into some kind of form that the receiver will understand. Now, in our case, it'll be language and associated words to that language. Now, the receiver needs to be receptive to the message. Receiver needs to be aware that there may be a message or is a message coming and has to be able to decode what the content of the message is. So if it's a language, as it typically would be, the receiver needs to have an understanding of the language itself. If not, for example, if I'm going to speak to an Italian group and I'm speaking in English and I don't know English, the process is going to fail. Now, that's one example of what we call barriers, is a language barrier. There's many, many others, and there's a section we'll talk about that a little bit. But that's basically what we're talking about. When the receiver does accept and understand the message, or even if they don't understand the message, they then send what we call feedback back to the receiver. Either I got it, I understand it, or I don't quite understand, I have questions. So that's kind of the process. It's like a circle. It has to be completed in that direction. The video will give you greater details. Using vocal elements effectively. Again, this is speaking. A speech class will, if you've had one, will have covered all this, but objective two will cover it in, enough detail so you have an understanding what's going on. Understanding nonverbal language. Well, there's many forms of nonverbal language. First might be facial expressions. That'll tell you a ton. A shrug. What does a shrug mean? Well, it means, yeah, maybe, I don't know, whatever the case might be. It will tell you if someone is interested or not interested, if they're paying attention or not paying attention. Facial expressions and body language, the use of the body, are actually sometimes more informative than what a person says to you. Couple of examples. If someone can make direct eye contact with you, the chances are they're being truthful. Uh, Another example might be a smile. Most everyone generally thinks means it's a positive response. Well, that's not necessarily so in all cultures. So we just need to be aware of how to interpret them. How do you interpret the nonverbal with the verbal communication? So again, the video, short. These are all short videos. There's two of them. There's one about body language, is verbal and nonverbal. Watch them both. They'll be very, very helpful. Developing credibility. Now, credibility is suggesting that the people or the individual or the person you are talking to has an understanding that, well, you have some degree of expert knowledge and that what you say is possibly important. Uh, for example, you have developed a credibility with students that, well, generally what my course's content is about is probably valid and reliable. And there's a number of reasons for that. Well, it could be because I've been working for 50 years. That might have a lot of experience there. It could be my education. There's a number of factors. Everyone can develop credibility. Now, a lot of students say, well, who am I? I'm a sophomore, junior, whatever in college, and really never worked in the industry. Well, you can develop or suggest some form of credibility. And no, it doesn't, you don't have to be very specific with that. But let's say you've been working as a busboy, or whatever they call bus person now, in a restaurant. You can say that, and you've been doing that for 2 years. You can say you have 2 years of restaurant management, or you have 2 years of restaurant retail experience, which is true. It doesn't have to be, to tell exactly what you did, but that might add credibility if you're talking about, what goes on during a shift at a restaurant. So again, most likely you all have some form or can create some form of credibility, because the more credible the image is of you, the more receptive your message will be. So this will help you talking about public speaking credibility, giving and receiving feedback. Most important, feedback is just basically responses, or maybe the lack of response. A lack of response can be feedback, but let's talk about the actual response you receive. Feedback can be positive, negative, or neutral. Now, positive feedback is always very good. It tells you you did a fine job, or maybe if we try this, it will might help to make your job even better. Positive. Negative feedback, unfortunately, um, is basically the way it sounds, negative. It's derogatory. It's critical. Now Positive feedback can tell you about your faults or where you may need additional help, but that can be given to you in a positive tone. Negative feedback, on the other hand, also gives you that same information, but it's harder to understand and accept it. So you're better off to give, shall we say, corrective feedback in a positive manner. Now, neutral feedback doesn't necessarily mean that there's anything about you. It could just be a totally disinterested group, or it's something that they already know about. But it's good to receive that because it helps you to figure out what was applicable, what wasn't applicable, and if you have to correct it down the road for something else, how to do that. So again, receiving that kind of feedback is important. And in my opinion, as far as giving feedback, always be positive. I don't care if it was the worst presentation in your life you've heard, someone spoke, it was disastrous. You still should be positive, even though you're going to give them corrective things. All right? If someone is doing a poor job and you are their supervisor, you're not going to destroy them. You're going to tell them what is wrong and how to improve it. That is positive feedback. All right. So it's best, the number one thing is keep it positive, even if it's good news or bad news. Believe it or not. Barriers, yes. We talked about barriers when we were talking about the communication process. Barriers can be physical, emotional, or non physical. Physical barriers could be something like distance, it could be loud noises, it could be something that is physically altering the communication process. Okay? Internal or emotional barriers are those that you probably don't have a lot of control of. Yes, you have control of physical barriers. If it's you can't hear, you speak louder or move closer. Example of that. Emotional barriers are, on the other hand, is if someone really does not like the answer, you may have difficulty um, trying to convince them other ways. You don't always have a lot of control. The best you can do is the best you can do. And if it's accepted, fine. If it's not, give it up because some people will never change. So those are the different types. There are cultural barriers. Okay. There's different cultures have different perceptions of communication. All right. Americans are very in your face type, meaning they're, loud and boisterous. Europeans, in many cases, or Southeast Asians, are not like that. They're not meek, but they're more reserved. So you need to be aware of these differences, particularly if you are communicating with an individual or groups that may be a different culture than yours. So this will certainly help you out too. Okay, those are barriers. Ethically, well, ethics. I guess the name of the game here for committing ethically is say whatever you are going to verbally present, it has to be accurate. Okay. And if it is accurate, you should be able to provide what we call support sources or citing for your position. Now, the last thing you really want to do is because there's plenty of people out there, and I'm the type of person that kind of looks out for this stuff, is to use information that is not quite accurate, but is skewed, meaning it is changed to support your position, even though it doesn't really support it. So I think the ethics is if it's good news, tell them that. If it's not good news, tell them that, but tell them in a way that is something that can be overcome. All right. Don't make up lies. Don't just say a bunch of baloney just so you look good. If it's not right, don't say it. Okay. Don't hype. Don't make a hypothetical. Always try to be as above base as you can. And if it's your opinion, say, it's my opinion of this. Okay. Don't make it sound like it's common knowledge or it is law or it is whatever. Okay. If it's an opinion, state that. I see a lot of people that make statements that are opinions, and they try to pass it off as being expert. Well, that doesn't work. So be careful with that. And then we already talked about the cross-cultural issues. Again, culture is a potential barrier. Can you change a culture, someone's culture? No, you can't. Only they can change it. But there are differences. And you all were born into a certain culture, and we all have multiple, quote, cultures. And it all depends on the situation at the moment. A lot of what we have, the basis of our culture, is always there, but we enhance it, modify it, tweak it as the need occurs. But be aware that culture is inherent in everyone, and it may be exactly like yours, and there won't be difficulty, but it may be completely opposite, 180 degrees from yours, and you can't change it. But the best you can do is be aware of the differences and try to overcome them as much as you can. Alrighty, that's basically um, this part one. Okay. So as always, there are the worksheets that are associated with this. When you are done all at once or one at a time, get them done, upload them in by Wednesday, I forgot, 23rd. Let's check and see. I forgot the date. Well, I don't have it on here, but I think it's Wednesday the 23rd. Get them on in so we'll get your points, and then we'll move on to part two of verbal communication. Alrighty, folks. I think that's long-winded enough for today. If you have questions, as always, feel free to send me an email. In the meantime, have a good week, and I will talk to you next week. Thanks. Bye.